IDMH at New Paltz, and it's my real honor to introduce today's presenters. They'll be discussing the extremely timely topic of responder resilience. This was a topic we actually started talking about or decided to focus on back at the very beginning of 2020, or possibly even earlier than that, well before the pandemic hit. And we chose that topic because we understand, even under normal conditions, whatever those might be, how high kind of baseline levels of stress and demands for workers in the healthcare and mental health fields are. So we were already planning to focus on that. Then, of course, everything got completely derailed by the pandemic, but we felt it was just all the more important to come back to this topic. So after the year we've all been through, this subject is not only sort of important, the kind of thing we know we all should be doing, but absolutely crucial for continuing to survive and be able to do your jobs. So we are very fortunate this year to have two presenters who have been very deeply immersed in the pandemic response from the very start through their roles with the Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, ASPR. So our presenters today are Rachel Call, who is a licensed clinical social worker and the behavioral health lead for the agency. She has an extensive background in providing guidance and direction to the behavioral health, public health, and emergency response communities throughout the country on various ways to enhance and integrate behavioral health services into preparedness, response, and recovery efforts in order to foster individual, community, and responder resilience. And she will be collaborating today with her colleague, Kayla Civi, who is a behavioral health program analyst for ASPR. In this role, Ms. Civi supports behavioral health preparedness, response, and recovery efforts. She also has a background in social work, and she has extensive experience in international community development and public health. So I'm going to turn it right over to them. Their goal for today, we know, is to give you not just, kind of the usual, we all should pay attention to this, but some real tangible tools that we hope you'll be able to use to maintain your well-being through what we know are just incredibly stressful times for everyone. So I will hand it over to Rachel and Kayla.
Thank you, Carla. And I'm very impressed with your ability to go through that bio and our mouthful of an agency and titles. So you did really well. Going to go on camera for just a minute, and I think Kayla will do that as well, just so you can kind of say us and we can say hello. As Carla mentioned, we both work for the Department of Health and Human Services. My background also includes quite a bit of community and state level disaster preparedness and response as well. And my primary population as a social worker has always been first responders. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. I've been working on it for a long time. I do have to say that this year has been uniquely challenging and has really tested every single one of ours creativity and ability and flexibility in terms of addressing healthcare worker, responder worker, behavioral healthcare worker, stress and resilience. I'm gonna let Kayla say a couple words about herself and then we'll get started with our content. Kayla?
Thank you. Just quickly, I also come from a social work background, and I've been working in behavioral health in the federal setting with Rachel for about a year now. And I have more of a community lens prior to my federal work, focused on HIV mitigation and prevention methods in Southern Africa. So that's a little bit about where my headspace is at, but I want to really dive into the content. So I'm going to hand it back over to Rachel.
Thank you, Kayla. We're going to go ahead and go off video, mostly because it distracts me. And I want to make sure that we're giving you content in a clear, concise way. So going off video now. So I want to explain a couple things. One, the title, I'm sure caught your attention. How long has your check engine been light on? And really, we had developed and have been working on different kinds of stress and resilience presentations and guidance for many years that are aimed at folks in public health or in responder kinds of communities. And the title of that was always, Is Your Check Engine Light On? Which is about understanding our signs and symptoms of stress, early warning signs, et cetera. And we'll talk about that as well in our presentation. But what really struck us over the last few months is not so much, is your check engine light on, but like, how long has it been on? How long have we been experiencing signs and symptoms of stress? How have they evolved? So we updated our title to reflect that. A couple things about the presentation is we do like to use the chat box to interact a little bit. There's quite a few of you registered and on this, so we may not get to everything you say, but instead of using the chat box during the presentation to ask questions, instead we're gonna sometimes ask you to weigh in the chat box, give us some of your impressions or ask you some questions, and we'll encourage you to use the chat box and participate that way. Because we have, a fair number of people, we've also incorporated some polls into the presentation that we really hope that you're going to participate in as well. And the other thing to keep in mind is there's a few occasions when we're going to link out to external websites just to show you what they are and to walk you through a couple of the resources that you'll find there. So you can just stay in the presentation while we do that, but when you actually are looking at the slides yourself, the links that we click on are live links in your slide deck, and you'll be able to link to those websites. And we'll also be highlighting other resources and other places to go. Those are all live links throughout the presentation, so we hope that you'll find those useful. Now let's go, and we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you do have something that you really want to make sure we cover more of, or you want to ask us about, we'll be pausing at the end to give you a chance to do that. So let's go to the next slide, Kayla. And basically today we're going to cover some foundational kinds of information, as Carla said, stuff that we probably, a lot of us know, but we're going to talk about that as sort of to set the foundation, but then we were going to want to sort of enhance that conversation by talking about the COVID pandemic context and what kind of that means for the stuff that we kind of have always known about stress and resilience. How is it adapted? How has it changed our concepts? We want to also pay some attention to some of the adverse conditions resulting from unresolved stress that we're starting to see more prevalence of, and that's concerning because some of these conditions are not terribly common, but now we're starting to see them being described more and in populations that we are not used to seeing them described in. So we're going to talk about those, and we're also going to talk about mitigation strategies to build resilience as well as to address those adverse conditions. Next slide. So who is this training about? Now, this image is one I borrowed from a colleague and friend of mine when he talks about going and creating trainings for people who are in service or helping or response professions. We sort of look at this mouse and this frog, right? And they're in a precarious position. They're in deep water, and the mouse doesn't have the capability to get to safe shores. And so the frog is the helper here and is responding to that mouse and is going to take that mouse to safer shores. And frequently when we attend or we design trainings, we're really thinking about that mouse and really looking at that mouse. How do we help the mouse? How do we know what the mouse needs? Where does the mouse need to go? This training is about the frog. And forgive me for equating you guys with frogs, but bear with me with the analogy, because the frog is only going to be able to help that mouse out if it stays afloat itself. And sometimes it's swimming and may not even know how long it has to swim. And I think I have certainly felt that way in this situation. But we really want to focus on keeping helpers and those in service afloat, even when it's hard, even when they're tired, because that is the only way we can continue to be of service and to help those that we've been committed to helping in our careers and our professions. So that's what this training's about. But I'm curious really quickly to see who's on the line in terms of where you're from. So we're going to launch a poll. Rebecca, if you can launch the first poll and just tell us kind of what is the practice setting or environment that you work in. And go ahead and take a minute and give me the one that works best for you. And if you really don't see your environment, you want to type it into the chat box, feel free to do that as well. All right, and some people, I see military as an environment, absolutely. Really important partners in all of this. Clergy, nursing home settings, community college, yep, we often have academia in this list, but we only have a choice of 5 that we're allowed to put in there. So Okay, good. Retirement communities, looks like some residential and community settings. It's some managed care settings, home health. Okay, excellent. Excellent. Hospital and some substance abuse settings. Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Let's go ahead and close the polling, Rebecca. All right. And so we are seeing most people are in the majority of people right now are in hospital or healthcare settings. But again, as evidenced by the chat box, there's a lot of you in other kinds of settings as well. Prison settings, hospital environmental safety. I'm seeing a lot of different kinds of settings. So we've got a very diverse audience here with diverse backgrounds, and that's great. So we're excited to see that. And there's a lot of you in behavioral health as well. So terrific. Thank you for letting us know about your practice setting. Let's tell you a little bit about our practice setting. You can go ahead and close that poll out. Thanks, Rebecca. Next slide. So our practice setting, just briefly, from a federal perspective, and in a disaster behavioral health, kind of resides in the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. But the vast majority of disaster behavioral health, as most of you probably know, occurs at the state, local, and community level. The federal role is strictly one of support of the entities out in the field that do the work. We may provide or develop or identify guidance, tools, resources that assist with that. Some agencies, such as the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, have grants that also can support these kinds of activities. But in our role, Kayla and I work to make sure that at a federal level, the public health and medical response to disasters and emergency events includes the integration of behavioral health. We want that in the preparedness stage, we want it in the response stage, we want it in the recovery stage. We work across the federal family to do that. We have many agencies that we work closely with, as well as with non-governmental entities like the American Red Cross, but we work with CDC, SAMHSA, obviously the Federal Emergency Management Association and others. And then we work really closely with our state and local partners so that we are identifying, developing, and disseminating the very best that folks in the field who are actually doing the work are engaged in. So that's our practice environment. Next slide. When we started really getting requests for training or guidance or just our thinking on how we were going to address the enormous challenges that the pandemic was presenting us, it was really difficult because we understood we have to think about stress and managing it in a different way. Generally, we all work in a steady state environment. Many of us have chosen environments that are high stress or have that capability of going high stress quickly. So we're used to that. But a disaster happens, disrupts our steady state, and then we work on activities and interventions that get us back to a steady state. And that's kind of the cycle. But now what we found is we were in a steady state. The pandemic happened and evolved and continued to grow. And instead of getting back to a steady state, no matter what kinds of actions, activities, and resources and response efforts we were putting to it, we found ourselves and find ourselves in this sustained operational engagement, which means the way in which we have to think about stress is different. Because right now, we're not back to a steady state. And if you notice, there's no link back there right now. Now, having said that, I want to acknowledge that the promise of vaccines starting to come out and a distribution plan starting to unfold out in our communities is a promising thing. But I would also say that the idea of getting back to a steady state, I'm not sure what that's going to look like. Pretty sure it's going to look different than it used to. But I do have some hope now that we are going to be able to see a light at the end of this tunnel. Next slide.
So within that sustained operational engagement, we've really tried to capture some of the stressors that have emerged during COVID or have become more prevalent. And we've done this through stakeholder engagement and talking to people working on the ground like all of you. And we pulled together this list. It's not comprehensive, but it does capture a lot of what we are hearing. So I'd like you to look through these stressors and put the number or maybe numbers of stressors that really resonate with you into the chat box. So which stressors are you experiencing, have experienced, and just put those into the chat box. You can also write them down, or if you have the slides printed out, you can circle or mark them. I see that someone commented all. And this is something that we've heard a fair number of times, is like this understanding of not experiencing just one or just two or three stressors, but really experiencing an overload of stressors. And I am trying to capture all of the numbers that are being presented to me, but it seems like through the chat that all of these stressors are being touched on. Rachel, is there anything you'd like to reflect on here?
Yeah, I was just noticing, which does not surprise me, that between the long-term ambiguity and also the changes in guidance and guidelines, those are coming up over and over again here, as well as the increased workload, which is not surprising. But I think what has been so challenging, we can all agree, is that as the science has kept, evolving on this, so has the guidance, so has the recommendations. And while that's understandable, it has made certainly our jobs, whether we're in health, public health, behavioral health, or emergency response or healthcare, extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Kayla.
Thank you. Definitely. And I'm going to move on so that we can kind of shift to stress and how we're framing stress. And just so we're on the same page, we're really defining stress as that response to a stressor. And one of the ways that we can really frame this is through a continuum of stress and looking at performance. So many, if not most of you, have chosen stressful jobs and you really thrive in stressful environments. There's a reason you're working where you're working. And avoiding stress altogether is really not the objective here. And that's not what we're looking to do. Instead, we can use this continuum of stress as a tool for understanding and assessing when stress is working for you and when it isn't, and where there's movement for change, so that we can dial back up if needed to sort of that apex of this bell curve with optimum performance, instead of potentially running on fumes and getting closer and closer to burnout. And another way that we can sort of look at this is through a color gradient, a continuum of stress. And this may be a more familiar model to you. And this moves from ready, where you're ready to stay, you're emotionally and physically healthy, you're ready to go, your performance is fantastic. There's the reacting phase where maybe there are changes from normal behavior and temporary or mild distress. And then we have injured, where there can be inner conflict and unresolved trauma and more severe and lasting effects. Finally leading to ill, and this is where you really need to seek medical attention. So can we launch the next poll, please? So I'd like you to look at this continuum of stress and try and identify and figure out, where would you put yourself in the last 30 days? Where do you immediately identify if this resonates with me? And I'll just give a little bit more time.
I know, Kayla, early on, I was in, square on in that sort of between ready reacting. I was doing really well and I was creative and I was motivated. It was hard and I was worried, but I was really on my game. And then at various points, as the days and weeks and months went on, I certainly found myself falling over to that other edge of the bell curve.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Can we close the poll, please? Okay, and can we share the results? So it seems like the vast majority of people are really identifying with that yellow, that reacting phase. and a little bit the orange and injured. And I do find this interesting because in previous conversations that we've had and trainings, a lot of people really identified more so with like the orange verging on red, this ill section. So definitely thinking about what Rachel mentioned earlier in this promise of a vaccine and changes in dynamics, it really gets me thinking. Rachel, is there anything you'd like to add here?
No, I agree with you. And I think it really just depends on kind of what's happening in your community or environment at the time, how long you've been working. Maybe we're getting better at some of this. Some of us are starting to just get better at engaging, coping, because we have to. This is not ending, and we need to get better at it. So I think that's interesting. Thank you, Kayla.
Oh, thank you. And I enjoy that someone put in the chat that it really depends on the day and that there's a volatility with all of this. And I'd like to really appreciate that comment. And I will hand it back over to Rachel.
What we do know, next slide, Kayla, is that there are consequences for people who are responders or providers or those in service, so to speak, that are significant because our work and what we're called to do really relies on our being able to function and maintain performance or get back to high levels of performance after a time when maybe we've been struggling. Unresolved stress, unresolved distress does result in things like poor thinking, decision-making that puts us and others at risk. We might make more mistakes. Our social supports, whether at work or at home, may be strained based on how we're reacting to our distress. And then, of course, there's health implications to include maybe self-medicating or overuse of substances in a way to numb out sort of feelings of pain or to even function at a higher level. And ultimately, unaddressed, that's going to lead to burnout. But the complicating factor for folks like you, like us, is displayed in the cartoon next to it, which is my little cartoon character there is used to and happy to carry stress. That's kind of what they signed on to do. And even when asked, hey, how are you doing? They're going to say, I'm doing fine. I'm doing well. Even as that burden gets heavier, and even when being offered assistance, still reassuring that everything's fine, nothing to see here, until crushed under that weight of other people's stress, of the nature of the work, still saying 2 thumbs up, doing great, right? And I certainly recognize myself at various points in my career in this cartoon, and it reminds me that I need to remember not just to know when to reach out for help, but also to know when to accept help that's being offered. And that can be challenging for some of us. Next slide.
And part of that self-awareness piece is really understanding your signs and symptoms of stress. So during steady state, you may already have a really great handle of what your signs are when you're stressed, how you know when you're experiencing stress, those flags that pop up. What we're seeing with COVID is really that prolonged exposure to stress is changing the ways people are experiencing and presenting stress. So what you typically experience may change, which makes it more challenging and difficult to identify when it's happening and have that assessment point of, okay, this is happening, this is a red flag, I'm stressed and I need to do something about it. Rachel, would you like to go over the check engine metaphor?
Well, exactly. I mean, if a check engine light comes on, most of us would not be driving around with that check engine light on. We may not know what's wrong, but we know it's telling us something's wrong. So kind of, what's my check engine light? The problem is, and as I said at the beginning, a lot of us have been driving around with the check engine light on for a long time, because who has time to go figure out what's happening, or even to address it, or even maybe the resources to do it right now. But really coming back to, hey, in the past, how would I have known that something's up? I'm not performing, I'm not behaving, I'm not feeling the way I normally do or the way I prefer to. So what can I do about that? We may be past those early warning signs now, and I get that, but it's still relevant to reflect on those. Again, a lot of how I like to frame stress is about appraisal and awareness, right? So the first thing is, as we went over, what are the stressors? What are the things that are stressing you? And then the next thing is, well, how do I know? How do I know I'm not doing well? Another analogy I just want to bring in that a friend of mine uses is the broken tail light, right? So if you're driving with a broken tail light, you may not know that, but you know who knows that is the person that got your back. So another question I would recommend is if you're having a hard time really in a concrete way identifying the signs and symptoms of stress for yourself right now, whether you're having them, how bad they are. Who's got your back? Who could you turn to and say, hey, does it look like everything's working the way it should right now? Or do I need to take a look at fixing something? So just using my car analogies for now, but that's where the check engine and the broken tail light come in. Next slide for me, Kayla. And again, just moving kind of beyond how we normally conceive of stress in this sort of buckets of, is it acute, chronic, traumatic stress disorders, where we'd sort of look at symptoms and place them in those buckets or align them with those buckets and think about their severity. And we do that so that we have a way of then identifying the most likely productive ways of addressing those kinds of disorders and conditions. So what we have noticed in the last several months is that conditions that we didn't normally see as often, as frequently, or as intensely in certain populations are starting to become more and more of a concern and more commonplace. And we're going to spend much of this presentation talking about these conditions, particularly compassion fatigue, caution fatigue, complex grief, and moral injury. We're going to go through each of these, kind of get a foundational on, what is this to start, and then we'll talk about ways that you might want to consider mitigating them. Next slide, Kayla. So let's talk about burnout first, which is a term I'm sure everybody's familiar with, have used it, maybe feel it right now. And it's really the result of maybe cumulative stress that's been unresolved, maybe too much of a workload, can also result from feeling underappreciated or marginalized in some way. That can lead to burnout as well, tends to occur over time, and tends to be something that one can self-diagnose. One can say, I think I'm getting burned out, or I'm pretty burnt out. It certainly displays around in your teammates and others as sort of a decreased morale, people not showing up, not being as reliable as they once were. Often, people becoming more cynical, gossiping more about others. That kind of behavior can often signal burnout, and burnout, unfortunately, can also be a bit contagious. So it's something that it's important to address. Next slide. Compassion fatigue, which in years past, I've done presentations where folks kind of equate the two as, they use the terms interchangeably, and they're not really interchangeable terms. They're different conditions. And let me just ask really quickly, I'm going to ask you to use the chat box again. How many of you are familiar with compassion fatigue as a condition? Just a Y or an N in the chat box. Yes, I'm really familiar with this. Not really. Okay, good. I am seeing everybody very, few people are like, no, not something I'm not familiar with, but most people are very familiar with this as a condition. And particularly, I think in the last several months, it's become much more common in the lexicon in terms of the news media and conversations that we're having. But the basic thing about compassion fatigue that I really want to emphasize here is it is a result of sort of having qualities that make you good at your job, if that makes sense. That's why it's a tricky condition. The ability to connect and to empathize and to really relate to the folks that we're serving or trying to help is something, those abilities also put one at more risk for developing compassion fatigue. And being exposed to other people's suffering, other people's trauma can actually injure you. So you're being injured by other people's trauma. And that's the danger of it. What makes it even trickier is it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't still perform your work. It might even look like adaptive coping in some ways, because folks who are experiencing compassion fatigue may start to feel a little numb towards the folks that they serve or that they're trying to help. They may feel disconnected from them, detached. And that may look like a way of sort of adaptively coping, but it can also be very distressing for the person who's experiencing it. Folks with compassion fatigue may present with rigid thinking or kind of conversely over engagement, sort of not being able to stand down, not being able to stop, take a break or take a day off or stop reading the news or watching whatever station you watch on COVID matters or matters related to your work. So that kind of over engagement can also be an issue as well. But as I said, it can be difficult to self-diagnose because folks suffering from compassion fatigue sometimes are still very effective at what they're doing, but it doesn't change the fact that they are injured and really can damage their personal and professional relationships and abilities if they don't address it. Empathy fatigue, somebody wrote in, is yes, another phrase that's come up that people use as compassion fatigue as well. Next slide. So just in terms of those conditions, right, burnout and compassion fatigue, part of this is about understanding how satisfied you are at work. I mean, we all want to retire or leave our job as passionate about it as the day we walked in, right? So let me ask again, and we're going to launch a poll. One self-assessment tool we really like is the Professional Quality of Life tool, the ProQual, which has been around for a long, long time. So can you launch the poll, Rebecca? I'm just curious of how many of you have ever taken this self-assessment before, the ProQual. I'm going to give you a couple seconds. There's a lot of you, so I need to give you a couple seconds to weigh in. I've taken it several times in my career, and it's different every time, but it's a really useful place to start thinking about where you are and where you want to go. And hopefully some of the strategies we'll be talking about will be relevant depending on where you score. Okay, great. You can close the poll and show the results. So a lot of you have not taken this before. So I'm glad that we're going to introduce you to this because it's a simple tool and it's useful. Can you go ahead and close those results out for me, Rebecca? And Kayla, let's go ahead really quickly and go out to the ProQual self-assessment tool. We're not going to do it right now, and I'll show you why, but I do want to show it to you. So the ProQual is a one-pager in terms of questions it asks you. It's pretty simple. Can we bump that size up a little bit for me, Kayla? Thank you. And you can see that you scale yourself on a Likert scale of 1 to 5 in each of these statements of where you put yourself on never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. And it goes through a variety of questions that are trying to get at 3 different things. On the next page, once you've done your self-scoring, is instructions on how to score it. And it's going to give you a score in basically compassion satisfaction, like how happy are you with what you're doing, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. That's really how it's going to score. And you'll notice that it asks you to add up different questions to get to those scores. So what I recommend, and then at the end, it'll show you kind of where you fall. And that's going to help you identify ways that you can enhance that compassion satisfaction score by addressing whether you're more in the compassion fatigue side of the house or the burnout side of the house. And a couple people are asking if they can get this. And this is a live link in the slide deck. So you can go out to this directly from the slide deck after this presentation. That's you're going to get 2 homework assignments, and that's one of them. Actually, I'm going to give you 3. So this is your first homework assignment after this presentation. All right, let's go back to the slide deck. And Kayla's also put the link in the chat box in case you want to get to it that way right now. Next slide, Kayla.
So by a Y for yes or an N for no, can people put in the chat box if caution fatigue is a term they know about? Is this a term you've heard before? And I'm seeing a lot of no's and a couple yeses. And This does not surprise me. Caution fatigue is something that entered our radar a couple months ago. And this is when there's an understanding of actions needed to protect yourself and others, but a level of exhaustion and fatigue that results in slipping out of those habits and engaging in unsafe practices that were previously feasible. So if we think about this, what are some indicators that you can think of caution fatigue? And you can put that into the chat box. And Rachel, feel free to chime in here as well.
I keep getting invited to people's houses. that hasn't happened for a while. And suddenly in the last month, people have decided that it's okay to have friends over to their houses. My friends are, many of them are in the healthcare and public health field. So that's surprising in my world. In terms of caution fatigue, I have not accepted those invitations, but I look at that as an indicator that people are tired.
Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing in the chat box either not wearing your mask properly or forgetting your mask altogether, as well as social gatherings. And this is becoming more and more important in conversations and is coming into more conversations with the holidays and the holiday season, and a lot of people really wanting to engage in gatherings and practice holidays and spend time with family. All right. And Rachel, as long as you don't have anything else to add, I'm going to move on.
Let's go ahead and move on, Kayla. So we're going to talk about how some ways to manage all of these conditions, by the way, including caution fatigue. I appreciate everybody's input on that. Another condition is complex or complicated grieving. I think we can all agree that the losses have been significant and many for virtually everybody related to this pandemic, whether it's loss of actual people in our lives, loved ones, colleagues, or just things we love to do, places we love to go, activities that we cherish, our faith communities, our social network. All of these have been affected, and there's been significant losses. An article that came out in October in JAMA is called "The Mental Health Disorders Related to COVID-19 Related Deaths." And it's a really good article, and this is a live link to it that you can read it when you have time. But basically, it kind of rings the bell to warn about widespread complex or complicated grieving. And grief is a normal, understandable process that we go through when we have losses. But complicated grieving is different because it's basically grief that results in impaired functioning, disrupted behavior. And part of this is due to the fact that our normal processes for managing grief and healing, we are limited in our ability to do that, whether it's rituals, whether it's being with people that can support us through loss and grief. So what we're likely to see is more and more evidence of this as people enter into depressive disorders, maybe anxiety disorders. These complicated grief can result in other kinds of coexisting conditions that are difficult and painful to deal with. So the JAMA article does a nice job of laying out why this is a concern and what it would look like, and also recommends sort of a public health approach to addressing it, which is really about kind of community-based partnerships as well as education around grief, around how we can in creative ways manage and process the losses that we've experienced. It's about working with primary care physicians, faith and spiritual community leaders, educators, to really understand how grief is showing up in their environments and how they can support and advise the populations or the people that they work with, serve, or engage with. So I think this is going to be an important thing for all of us to be thinking about in the coming weeks and months, because even though there's a lot of good news out there, or more positive news than there has been, there's still an awful lot of loss and an awful lot of loss expected. Next slide. Let me also ask about this condition I mentioned, moral injury. And again, just Y or N in the chat box. Is this a condition, moral injury, that you are familiar with? know a bit about, or not really? Maybe you've heard the phrase, but don't know that much about it. Okay. And here I'm seeing more no's than yeses, but I am seeing some yeses. Kind of depends on your environment, because moral injury is a term and a condition that we've known about for a long time. But primarily, we talked about moral injury in the context of military populations, particularly combat veterans. And really, it is kind of what you would think. It is an injury that is sustained because you have been exposed to or involved with actions or activities that really just go against your code, your moral code, or the way you sort of feel the world should work. And you feel part of that somehow, or witness to it in a way that you are unable to prevent it or do something about it. And it leads to feelings of shame. It can actually lead to anxiety and almost post-traumatic stress kinds of symptoms, and guilt, as well as things like anger. And folks who suffer from moral injury frequently have a very difficult time talking about it, because it is going to involve talking about things that they may be ashamed of, or extremely distressed that they were witness to or involved with. So the thing about moral injury is that, as I said, we've been studying it, looking at it for a long time, and there's really good evidence and science behind how we address it if we look at military populations. But what we're starting to see and hear are evidence that folks in healthcare, emergency response, prison systems, school systems, because of the kinds of choices they have to make in terms of allocating limited resources, maybe treatment standards that have had to change because of lack of resources for staffing, experiences that they're seeing or hearing about with people who are trying to manage the multiple ill effects of this pandemic. We are seeing people in those kinds of professions, helping professions, starting to talk more about moral injury or things that would indicate moral injury. And the concern for me is, if we don't know about it and we don't understand it, and we don't look for it, and it's going to be very hard to treat if we're not looking for it. So I'm really recommending this topic as one that people just spend a little bit more time on when you have the chance. Again, we'll have some more resource links at the end of this presentation that can do a deeper dive on moral injury. But in general, that's what the condition is, and that's what the concern is. Next slide, Kayla. Oh, wait, we want to do a poll first, don't we? So let me stop, sorry. And I'm just curious, because we've been talking a lot about these negative conditions and the stuff that we're worried about. And we really want to get onto, so what do we do about it? Want to get onto the positive stream on this. But first, I'm curious, when you think about the conditions that we just talked about, which would you say in your environment or role are you at most risk for? And we're going to launch that poll now. Of the conditions that we just talked about: burnout, compassion fatigue, complex grief, moral injury, or caution fatigue. Just in your role and what you do, you say, you know, if I think about me, this is what I'm probably most at risk for. And that's not saying you have it now. It's just given the work that you do and what you're exposed to. And we'll give it another minute. I always feel like I should have Jeopardy music playing here. We'll have to add that into the presentation next time. And let's go ahead and close the poll and show the results. And what we can see is many of you feel that your biggest risk is burnout. Well, the good news about that is that there's a lot of things you can do about burnout, and it doesn't have to be as complicated as some of these other conditions, which may require a higher level of care. Having said that, there's still a lot of you that are concerned about compassion fatigue, which doesn't surprise me given who's on the line. Complex grief is for some of you, moral injury, not as many, and then caution fatigue. So just understanding what you're at most risk for will also help you identify some of the strategies that you can use to prevent it or to address it early if you feel like you're starting to slip into one of these conditions. Okay, we can go ahead and close the results of that. Thank you. And now we can move to the next slide.
So now we can really shift into what are we going to do? What can we do about this? And first and foremost, we can start with really the foundational components of self-care and really building coping strategies. And one of the ways I really enjoy visualizing it is looking at the graph on the right side, where we have the physical piece where it's that foundational component of sleep, movement, hygiene, eating food regularly. And then we have this social component, which has been incredibly impacted by COVID. And we have this mental piece and activities that really stimulate the brain. So doing a puzzle, reading books, and the emotional piece. This can be seeing a therapist, journaling, or self-expression through music or arts, and then spiritual as well. So I'd like to launch another poll. And if you look at sort of these categories, where would you put yourself? Where do you tend to focus your coping? And I find this a simple but great exercise in really identifying where you're focusing your coping and looking at sort of the domains that coping can live, and if there are spaces that you can build or add on to. And we can close the poll. Okay, so I'm seeing basically a tie between physical and social mental, which unfortunately I think got merged together. Sorry about that. But I think that this is a great exercise to sort of get you thinking about where you are and where you have movement for change. And in conversations that we've really had recently in relationship to COVID, there's more and more conversations about managing news and being incredibly intentional about the time you spend immersing yourself in news exposure and social media and identifying what is healthy for you, and being flexible to change that and adjust that. And I would like to respond to one of the comments. And yes, spirituality and religion may be confused. We tend to use this bucket as a catch-all for any type of spirituality or religious engagement that you may practice as part of your self-care as a category.
Kayla, I just want to point out, yeah, when I look at spirituality, I look at how do you make meaning in the world, right? Whether that's through an organized, structured religious orientation or something that's less defined by that. It's still sort of how do you make meaning, what resonates for you on that. Let's go ahead to the next slide, Kayla. So as we talk about, okay, so that's kind of the foundational stuff, right? The stuff you know you need to do in those different categories. I bet you can all think of examples of what you do that would fit into those buckets. But one of the things that happened to me around, I think it was about August, I was feeling pretty discouraged. As Carla had mentioned, Kayla and I and my colleagues have been working COVID since literally January, often with and I know many of you too, very little time off, very little time to step away. It's a constant context that we're in, whether we're work at home. And I was starting to feel pretty discouraged about where we were going and how we were going to get out of it. And then I attended a presentation that was given by a couple of folks who are psychologists that work at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, which is basically the Army med school. And they're involved in a program called the Consortium for Health and Military Performance, CHAMP. And they work with basically combat veterans, people who are going to be going into places where it's pretty hard to be resilient and hard to be optimistic, right? And what one of the main points of their presentation is that optimism is something that you can build as sort of a mental strength, so to speak, an optimistic way of perceiving of situations and approaching issues. And that really set a light off in my head. I thought, well, because I was not feeling optimistic. And I'm wondering, what do they mean by that? And the first thing they did is they redefined optimism for me. So it's not sort of, as I've always thought about it, kind of a Pollyanna, the glass is half full, look on the bright side, right? It's actually, the way they define optimism is an optimist is really a realist. An optimist is somebody who takes a look at a situation and assesses it for what it is, and then decides what they do with that. It's very practical, problem solving, solution focused kind of thinking. And another way to illustrate that was if you look on the slide, you see two glasses, each have clear liquid in them. Well, if you say, okay, in the glass on the left, there's clear liquid in it, and that clear liquid is water. So maybe in the past, I would have said, an optimist isn't just going to say, oh, the glass is half full. Maybe that's how I would have thought of it in the past. But actually, what an optimist would do is say, hey, that glass has water in it. How can I get more water into that glass, right? So it's not sort of a half full, half empty. It's, oh, okay, that's a good thing. I want more of that good thing. How do I get it? Now, let's say that optimist looks at the glass on the right, same glass, but this time the glass contains poison. So an optimist isn't going to say, well, at least it's only half full of poison. An optimist is going to say, I don't want that in that glass. So how do I get that out of that glass so that I can start replacing it with good stuff? I want to get bad stuff out and put good stuff in. So it kind of leads you to action. And it really is a way of thinking. I think it's really interesting, and it just really helped me. We're going to go really quickly. We're going to link back out to their website because I want you to see that they have in this CHAMP program a lot of different resources and tools that I think are really relevant for many of us, not just military folks, because it is hard to be optimistic all the time, particularly given our environment or what we're seeing and exposed to. So how can we do it? So they've got a lot of suggestions on how to power your performance with optimism. But one of the first things they recommend, and you can go down there a little bit, Kayla, is doing a self-check, like your own optimism self-check. And they give you a list of 10 questions, and following each question is a phrase, one of which is more optimistic in the way it's thinking, and the other is less optimistic. So we're going to come out of this website, but I really encourage you all to go there when you have some time. And we're going to go back to our slides. And I actually just want to take a minute and I want to do this self-check with you. So next slide, Kayla. On the next two slides, we've got this optimism self-check activity. So on the first slide is the first 5 questions. I want you to look at these questions and look at the phrases that follow them. And just to yourself, mark down for yourself where you tend to find yourself agreeing or in your gut really saying, yeah, that kind of sounds like me. So what are your thoughts? And just again, you're just marking this down for yourself, where you fit on the more optimistic side or maybe on the less optimistic side. What are you saying to others? And how are you spending your time? How are you persisting through this struggle? How is your longevity right now? Stamina. How are you approaching others during this struggle? How are you connecting with others? Are you connecting with others? Which one resonates most with you? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and then the next 6 questions, right, or next 5, is how do you see yourself? What is your self-perception in this struggle? Which one resonates the most? It doesn't have to be exact. How are your emotions impacting your ability to navigate through the struggle? And how is the struggle affecting the rest of your life? Your home, your relationships, your self-care. And what about your attention? What do you find you tend to be concentrating on the most? And then what about your view of the future? How is this struggle impacting your view of the future? All right, so kind of reflect for a second on where you found yourself. And I know that when I did this, and I did not find myself all on one side or the other. You know, when I heard about this and I attended this presentation, as I said, I was in a pretty discouraged frame of mind, but not all of my thinking is pessimistic, right? But it helped me sort of engage in, okay, so where could I really shore up my approach to things to be more optimistic? So, I mean, hopefully you found that you were also spread out a little bit between this as well. So then, okay, so how do I become more optimistic or practice this? Because you think about it almost like a muscle, right? A mental muscle. Next slide, Kayla. With the CHAMP program, folks, advised is sort of taking this approach, really taking a look, again, remembering you're taking a look at the situation for what it is. And then you sort of identify what within this situation do I have control over or influence over? Then compartmentalize out the things that I have less control or influence over, because I want to focus on the things that I can take productive action on, no matter how minor. And I want to reflect and be able to find the good, whether it's in the situation itself or in what I'm able to do or what I have done. And you can do that by using these coaching questions that we put up on the right as well. One of the coaching questions that one of the presenters, Dr. Gabe Pagliaetti, recommended was kind of getting up in the day and thinking about orienting your day and saying, who can I help today? And that really was powerful for me to just think, wow, if I get up in the morning and say, yet another COVID day, right, with a lot to do, more than I can do by the end of it, instead waking up and saying, all right, who am I going to help today? Who am I going to try to contribute to whatever it is they're doing, maybe engage with to support them, check in on, to make sure that they have everything they need? Like, who can I help today? And I found that to be a really powerful, powerful thing for me as an organizing principle for the day. And to tell you the truth, I even on Mondays, frequently in the morning, I sit down and I schedule 2 or 3 connections with people that I know I want to reach out to, check on, or that I think are engaged in work that I could be helpful with. And that's something I do on a really intentional basis, and it's really helped me. And it made me really feel more optimistic. So if this resonates with you, I definitely recommend playing around on their website. They've got a lot of nice tools and a lot of nice resources and guides. Again, all of these links are live in the slide deck, and you'll be able to get to them yourself after this presentation. Next.
So another way that we can really take productive action is through another activity, creating a resiliency plan. And this is one you can do on your own time. But here it's really boiled down to identifying resiliency skills and identifying one that you currently use and one that you would like to develop or enhance, and picking one that is feasible and fits you and what you need and what you can do. So I'd invite you to put in the chat box maybe a resiliency skill that you would like to develop or enhance. You can also write it on a piece of paper. And I'm seeing from the chat box that some people are identifying with a realistic sense of control, having choices, getting up and moving, as well as engaging in activities that are meaningful to you. And I do appreciate the all of the above. Okay, so we are going to move on, but I do encourage using this as just a very quick activity to pinpoint one thing, one aspect, one resiliency skill or strategy that you can incorporate.
Well, you'll notice a lot of them are about engaging with others. And because we do know the foundation of resilience that the evidence really supports is the social connectedness. It doesn't have to be sort of the number of people you connect with, it's kind of who you connect with and how you connect with them. And related to that, as we talk about some of the conditions that we went over earlier, with burnout and compassion fatigue, there's a lot of different strategies one can use, particularly with burnout. Thinking in terms of it's about fatigue and exhaustion. So for yourself, are you able to step away even for short periods of time, take a break, take some time off, maybe change the activities that you've been engaged with and do something new for a day, help with another task that maybe your team is working on. Those kinds of things can really help with burnout. But other things that can help with burnout is sort of relying on other people. And this also helps with compassion fatigue. The link at the bottom of this slide would take you to a longer training that was developed by our colleague, April Natural, and our colleagues at Asper Tracy, which is the Technical Assistance Center for our organization. And it's a nice presentation that goes into kind of the umbrella of cognitive restructuring, kind of strategies that can help you change how you think or appraise or cope with things. That can directly improve or address compassion fatigue. So one of these strategies I pulled out from that presentation, which is adaptive engaging, because it's one I think that's really powerful and can have use across these different disorders. And it's about understanding who you're engaging with. Are they people that provide you energy, support, allow you to sort of behave as your best self? Or are you finding that you're being pulled into more toxic situations, conversations, people's behavior that does not really lend itself to good coping, doesn't really inspire you to cope well? Who gives you energy versus takes it? And the work we do, we give away a lot of our energy, a lot of ourselves. So it's important to know who in our life kind of builds that reservoir back up, both in our professional sphere and our personal sphere. Something we really recommend, if you don't already have one in your agency or in your team or in your practice, is using a buddy system. Identifying, 2-3 people that can be relevant buddies for you, that can be that person that's looking for your broken tail light. It's good when that buddy knows they're your buddy, so that they know they're looking out for you when you're in a stressful situation or you're headed into a difficult assignment. I certainly have several people that I can count on and regularly interact with, even though we're socially distant now. I don't see them anymore. But we schedule calls, we make sure that we check in on each other regularly. We put it in the calendar as recurring calendar invites, because I want to make sure that as I'm trying to do the important work that I and my team are doing, I'm also getting my energy and my my needs met. And I have somebody looking out for me too and giving me a reality check on how I'm coping. So I recommend thinking about that. If you haven't already done that, think about asking or identifying someone who can be your buddy as we go through the next few months and can help you really build your resilience and encourage you to do that. Next slide. I talked about moral injury, and I just want to say the one thing about moral injury, and not a lot of you thought that you were at great risk for this, which is good. What I do want to say, though, is I think in healthcare that more people are at risk for this than we might think. And unless we're asking about it or looking for it or recognizing it, we're not going to be able to treat it. So the good news is there's a lot of evidence-based treatment out there. The National Center for PTSD has a variety of approaches and training and materials about moral injury. The link down here will take you there, as well as a link that we have in the back of the presentation. But they really look at first relying on kind of a peer support modality, because if you are somebody suffering from moral injury, it's basically something that only somebody who does the work you do or understands the environment you're in is probably the only kind of person you'd want to talk to about it. It's really about enhancing existing coping skills, but then identifying what the specific moral injury issues are. Is it guilt? Is it shame? Is it pain? What is it? So there are really good treatment modalities for that. Next slide, Kayla. And for those of you who may be behavioral health professionals, if you look down this list of interventions, you may be using some of these treatment modalities anyway if you deal with anxiety or stress disorders, traumatic stress disorders. Some have been adapted to be more specific to moral injury. And I just want to kind of reflect that if one is suffering from moral injury, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to go into a long-term intensive therapy. There are many modalities that are short-term in nature, very concrete in nature, and there's a lot of options. Every single one of those interventions is a live link to more information and training on those modalities. And I just really encourage those of you who may be working with healthcare professionals or people that you think are at risk for moral injury to take a look at those and get more information and more training on it if you think that would be appropriate to the work that you do. Thanks. Next slide.
So we've captured some strategies for really overcoming caution fatigue, and this is pulled from the National Indian Health Bureau, and it's linked in the bottom left hand. And the first strategy is really understanding what motivates your behavior and unpacking the dual aspects of that. So really understanding what is motivating your behavior to keep yourself and others safe, and also understanding what is motivating your behavior to slip into unsafe practices. So really assessing both sides. So we're going to focus on the first piece of motivating behaviors to keep yourselves and others safe. And can we launch the next poll, please? So I'd invite you to sort of look through these statements and pick the statement that best defines what motivates your behavior and what resonates with you.
Particularly when you're behaving in a way that is promoting the safety and health of everybody, right? Your best behavior. What motivates that?
Okay, can we close the poll, please? Okay, so it seems like a lot of people are really captured by the first statement of being cautious to protect family and loved ones. And I know personally, this is one that I definitely relate to. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Rachel, is there anything else you'd like to add here?
Oh, just that, I think that is sort of the altruistic or the, hey, we're doing this to protect everybody. That is, I think, what motivates most people to do the right thing or the best thing. I meant the best thing. But I still am very, concerned about getting this thing. And sometimes when somebody says, hey, there's only gonna be 4 of us hanging around my backyard, you wanna come over, I have to think about that because I'm in a situation where if I had a bad case of COVID and ended up needing care, that would be difficult right now. So that's something that motivates me as well. I really think about is a gathering for 20 minutes or half an hour with friends worth the risk at this exact time. So thanks, Kayla.
Thank you. And I'm going to actually hand it back to you to explain the checklist and the scuba diving metaphor.
Well, when caution fatigue first came up, we were talking about it in the context of hospitals, EMS, emergency service, kinds of things that we were starting to see actual professionals just slipping on doing the things that they need to do to really optimize risk, avoiding risk. So we started coming up with different strategies, one of which was kind of a checklist. I was thinking, I used to scuba dive, and when you scuba dive, I don't care how many times you've been in the water, you go through a checklist to kind of make sure everything is as it should be. You've got everything you need, you're safe, your air is on, your weight belt's on. And so when in my house, we started doing a checklist of just leaving the house as well. Like, do you have your mask, your hand sanitizer? Do you have the list for the grocery store? Have we done everything so that we're not going to be out there and just because we forgot or we got tired or we got busy, that we don't have what we need to keep ourselves safe and our neighbors and our families safe? So that's where the checklist idea comes in. But again, I'd also say that in my house, we keep each other pretty honest on this one. You don't leave the house without asking that everybody's got what they need. And I'd recommend that as well. But a posted checklist in the workplace is helpful if you're in an environment that requires PPE, et cetera. Next slide. I think the other issue with caution fatigue is it's not just what we're doing ourselves, it's what others are out there doing. And I just wanted to take a second to say a lot of this is about talking about it in positive ways, about if we maintain vigilance, it's going to be a good thing. I don't know if you look at those phrases on the left, if any of you have heard phrases like, hey, it's just going to be a small gathering and it's the holidays. We haven't seen our family in so long. It's important that we get together. Or, hey, the vaccine's coming out now and the science is telling us that younger people aren't getting as sick. So I'm going to start doing some of the stuff that I've been avoiding doing for a while. Or I really don't like being told what I can and can't do and where I can and can't go by a government or a community entity. I don't like that. It feels like an infringement on my rights. So I don't know if some of you have heard those phrases before, or maybe you're saying, hey, I said that just yesterday. But I'm really encouraging that we think about constructive conversations around this, because I do hear a lot of my friends and colleagues getting a little judgmental when they're faced with comments like this or behaviors like this. And that's understandable, but I don't think it's productive. And what I would encourage is, remembering that if we have conversations about this, maybe we can help people re-access that positive motivating element, the desire to protect themselves and their loved ones and their families and their communities, the things that bring out the best in their behavior. We can do that by, continuing to emphasize what the science tells us, the current science tells us, recognizing that people have had to give up a lot and have tried to do a lot to respond to or manage this environment of the pandemic, acknowledging that some of what they say is true. Some of the news is getting better, but there's still a ways to go, a long ways to go, quite frankly. And then reminding it that this is, we're trying to protect everybody, and that guidance and mandates and different kinds of rules and regulations are about that, not about limiting freedom. It's about doing what's best for everybody. So just wanted to kind of throw in the acknowledgement that these conversations, particularly around holiday gatherings and the time of year that it is, the fact that in many states it's cold right now, so that sort of outdoor social distancing, socializing is not as feasible. It's hard to continue to be vigilant, but it's important. So next slide, Kayla. And in general, thinking about how you want to react or respond to these kinds of statements or behaviors is really a good strategy. Think ahead so that you're not in a situation where you're reacting. One of the tools we created fairly recently was actually adapted from a lot of really excellent work that's been done in the past. Dr. Chip Schreiber has a Anticipate, Plan, Deter tool system that he's used for responders. The CDC has a tool that they use for their staff that they deploy to disasters and events. We also looked at the WHO and their materials, and we wanted to come up with something kind of streamlined that would be relevant for healthcare or public health kinds of environments. But I think it's probably relevant for anybody. And what we were thinking is there's so much information and guidance on kind of physical PPE, personal protective equipment. How do we help people understand that you also need behavioral health PPE? And that's what we really wanted to build here with this responder self-care plan. And by PPE, we mean predicting the problems, predicting what's going to be challenging, prescribing what you're going to do about it, or your coping or stress management strategies, and then also ensuring that you engage your plan, knowing when you're going to engage it and having supports in place to engage it. So we're going to go ahead and take you out. This is, again, linked into this slide deck. We're going to take you out to that plan. And it's your other homework assignment is to go through and look at this plan and create your own personal self-care plan. It's basically pretty straightforward if you move down through it. If you are somebody that is on an assignment, sort of deployment-based job or event, you can kind of put that down there so you know kind of where you were and when it was. But the most important meat of this comes further down, which is where you predict problems, right? And what we've put down are stressors that tend to be pretty COVID environment specific, but not all, not completely. And you kind of check off the ones that you know are problematic for you, challenging for you. Also, we'd ask you to think about a time or two in previous assignments or in your work where a stressor of some kind or a challenge really triggered you, negative reactions. It could be being cut off from social supports. It could be leadership challenges. There's a variety of things you could put there, but what was it that became really kind of problematic for you? As it's very personal, in addition to any of these other problems that might resonate going forward. So once you've predicted your problems, we're going to go to the next phase, which is prescribing your protection. And that really means, what are you going to do to cope with it? How are you going to take control of it, make it better? Are there any things you should avoid doing, anybody you should avoid doing? It's sort of like, what are you going to do about it when you're starting to feel like your performance or your well-being is in jeopardy? And then you got to engage the plan. So to do that, again, we go back to self-appraisal. It's about what are your red flags? What are your signs and symptoms of stress? When we're in stressful conditions, it's normal to have stress reactions. That's not an abnormal thing, but what are the ones that are going to get you potentially in trouble? The ones that you take a second look at and say, uh-oh, I really need to take a step back and engage one of these coping strategies that I said I was going to do. For me, poor concentration is always a big red flag for me because it's important that I'm able to concentrate. We provided some tips, some very concrete tips on how you can manage that stress. And what we've also encouraged you to do is to identify a buddy. Doesn't have to be just one, but identify somebody that you can rely on to help you engage your plan, how you get in touch with them. There's other people that provide that kind of support for you. And also, if your organization has any formal kinds of employee assistance or resilience programming, have that number handy, have that website handy so that you don't have to go looking for it. Further on down, Kayla, the last page is really kind of resources and reminders of some useful strategies. This psychological first aid model is from the WHO. Theirs is look, listen, link. There are many psychological first aid models, but basically this one we chose because it is so actionable given the audience that we're looking at here. We really wanted you to have an actionable, simple way of looking at psychological first aid, helping others, helping other responders, thinking of yourself as well. And then, of course, resources that you can link to for more information on behavioral health, disaster behavioral health, from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And then there's other sources from the CDC, from the CHAMP program that we told you about, and a couple of articles from folks that we base this work on. So when you have an opportunity, go and build your own personal resilience plan, build your own PPE for behavioral health. Even if you're already in the middle of work, middle of what you've been working on, it doesn't have to be pre-deployment if you're not somebody who deploys. But we're hoping you find it or parts of it useful as you start to think about how you want to take care of yourself going forward. Next slide.
And just really quickly, I understand that we are all really busy right now, but self-development is still incredibly relevant and important here. So we have some additional resources and trainings that you can sort of go through and see if any are applicable. But I would also like to thank you for attending this and taking the time to learn and engage with us as well.
So this is a graphic that's been floating around the internet for a while, but it's one I like and I keep coming back to it. And I found it early and I liked it early. this kind of who do I want to be during COVID-19? And this circles back with our kind of self-appraisal theme of this entire presentation. It's kind of all about really understanding yourself in this, right? And understanding that we go through different kinds of zones or phases. And in this one, it sort of says, okay, who do I want to be? In the fear zone, I'm really reactive, I'm fearful, I'm doing things based on my biggest worry. In the learning zone, once I've sort of maybe had some time, had some more information, I'm starting to really assess what's happening, what the situation really is, and what maybe I can do about it. And then in the growth zone, you're really kind of looking at how you can bring what you've learned, bring what you've experienced to bear in positive ways out there in your community and for others. And I like to remind people when I saw this isn't just a linear process and then you're like, yay, I'm in the growth zone, I'm just gonna stay here. I think that would be nice, but I think a lot of us move back and forth into zones depending on what we're experiencing, both at work and personally. But those first two, the fear and learning, to me are really about looking inward, being inwardly focused, and the external, that growth zone, is really about looking outward. And personally, that's where I prefer to be, looking out to see how I can contribute and what I can do. But I'm curious as to where you guys would say you are right now. I'm going to tell you with kind of this early stage of what's going on with the vaccines, I'm back in the learning zone right now, but I'm trying to get back to the growth zone, but I'm definitely in a phase of assessing what I'm hearing and seeing and learning, and managing my emotions related to that. Can we go ahead and launch the last poll, please? What zone would you guys put yourself in right now? And again, this is a graphic I pulled out. I mean, I use it a lot, so I think about it a lot, and I've moved around in it, but I find it helpful because it also helps me identify where I want to be, right? I want to be in the growth zone. I want to be out there doing things and feeling like I'm contributing. Okay, we'll do another 10 seconds on this, and then we'll go ahead and close the poll. And I appreciate you all who heard potentially my dog barking in the background. He's very enthusiastic today and appreciates your attendance. All right, let's close the poll and show the results. All right, so interesting, a lot of you, and I really didn't know where people would end up here. A lot of you are in the learning zone, and as I am, I agree. And many of you are in the growth zone, and some still feel or are in the fear zone, and that could be for a variety of reasons. As I said, it depends on what you're personally and professionally experiencing. That can make one feel more reactive and almost impulsive, emotionally driven, instead of more cognitively driven. That's very natural. But the learning zone and the growth zone is kind of where I want to be. And so this is a nice graphic if you want to use it with colleagues or even friends. Post it in your office, whatever you think would be most useful. Next slide. I'd be remiss, we're going to kind of wind down here if I didn't mention that there are signs and symptoms of stress that are not ones to just wait and see about. These kinds of signs and symptoms that we've listed here do require further assessment, whether from a medical or a mental health professional. And if you're not sure, if you or someone you even care about seems to be exhibiting some of this and you're not quite sure what to do, a couple of the resources on the right I want to call out for you is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Even if it's not you, but you're worried that someone you know is at risk of self-harm, you can call them and talk to somebody who's trained in suicide prevention and who can talk you through how to assess that and how to help somebody, how to help guide them to help. If you're just concerned for yourself or for someone else because they're distressed, because this has been going on a long time, and you're not quite sure how to help them, or you just want some suggestions yourself, you can contact the Disaster Distress Helpline, which is available 24/7, 365 days a year, and is staffed by trained crisis counselors. They also have a text feature, but it's if you don't rise to that level of suicidal, but you're still in need of some support, some help, resources, maybe even a referral, the Disaster Distress Helpline is an excellent resource for that. Next slide. We're going to give you an opportunity to ask some questions in the last couple minutes here. If you have any, you can put them into the chat box. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to have Kayla go to the next slide, because I just wanted to highlight for you that we have a bunch of additional resources that will take you kind of into a deeper dive on the content that we've given you today. So if there's any specific topic or issue that we brought up that you really felt like you wanted to learn more about, these links will take you to places where you can learn more about those things. And we encourage you to explore those, and I hope you find them useful and that you can use those with your populations. Let's go to the last slide, Kayla. And I'm going to let Carla at the end answer how we access slides after we're no longer live. And I believe everybody will be provided a PDF copy, but I'll let Carla answer that in just 1 minute. I do just want to close with a couple comments, and I know Kayla does too. We've gone through a lot of content, and we've gone through a lot of suggestions and resources and links. But at the end of the day, in terms of really kind of thriving or surviving and thriving during COVID, during this pandemic, I just suggest keeping it simple, right? The things that we know we do to take care of ourselves. Carla kind of started us off with this theme as well. Thinking about your sleeping and your eating, being kind to yourself, being kind to others, recognizing small wins. Those are the kinds of things that you can do. It's not complicated, kind of on a daily basis. You just maybe need to be reminded to do it. This is actually a card that you can cut out. It's on the ISTSS website. And it's something I'm sending my responders out with now, because I just find it a really valuable reminder that this is really the foundation of self-care and resilience. The rest of it builds and can enhance, but this is really the foundation. So Kayla, did you, and what I do want to also close my statement by saying what you all do in your environments is essential. It's important. We value you, and we're really honored that you spent time with us, because we know your time is valuable right now. And we really wish the best for you and everyone you care about in the work that you do. Kayla, did you have closing comments as well?
I would just like to echo that statement of thank you all so much for taking the time. I always have my notebook out on presentations like this where I take notes on just the fantastic experience and comments and thoughts that you provide during presentations like this. And yeah, I would just reiterate keeping it simple and going back to the basics when you need to. They're basics, they're foundational for a reason, and reassessing what you need on a regular basis, because what you need today may not be what you need tomorrow, and just, yeah, bringing it back to that foundational piece. Thank you.
Carla, we're going to turn it back to you to close this out.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Rachel and Kayla. So first of all, yeah, the slides were sent out this morning, so check your email if you haven't received that. And then I'm trying to get back to the very top of this in terms of, let's see, for getting the credit. An email will be sent following the training with instructions for completing it in order to get the HPP credit. So you'll have to sign back into the LMS, and then I believe you'll be able to access the slides there as well. And we have recorded this. We will be posting the recording on LMS and also probably on the IDMH website, just for people who don't need to do it for credit. So we will make sure we communicate that to everyone once that is available, because we know there was kind of short notice for signing up for this. And people are incredibly busy right now. So we absolutely want to get it out beyond the original audience who had the fortunate experience of being able to participate live today. So thank you so much, Rachel Call and Kayla Civi, for, that was such an insightful and genuinely useful presentation with so many actual resources and tools for people to use. For everyone out there, we are planning kind of a companion webcast for spring that will focus more on issues for supervisors and managers. So watch out for that as well if that applies to you. And I just want to close by saying to everyone in this audience, thank you so much for all of your incredible work throughout this year, trying to protect everyone. We know this has been uniquely hard circumstances, and everyone is just doing everything they can. So we partners from Institute for Disaster Mental Health, Steve Moskowitz at Office of Mental Health, and Tom Henry at Department of Health really hope this has given you some useful tools to take care of yourselves, because we need you out there taking care of everyone else. So thank you for everything you do. Thank you, Rachel and Kayla, and be well, have good holidays, and hopefully we will see you again in the new year. Take care, everyone.